Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the first EFSA webinar. I hope you're going to enjoy the experience today. My name is Jane Richardson and I'm here with my colleague
Manuela Tiramani.
And we're going to talk to you about the calculation tool for operator and worker exposure. Okay, we're just going to give a few simple explanations so that you can enjoy the webinar today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the meeting room, how to interact with us and ask questions, and an overview of the presentations and demonstrations you will have today. So first of all, you should have already seen our disclaimer and data protection policy. This was available when you registered for the webinar, but please be aware that the webinar is recorded, and if you don't agree with the policy, please disconnect yourself now. Okay, so you're in a virtual room, obviously, this morning, and so are we. This is automatically broadcast. One thing that I would like you to check now is that you can hear us, because there is audio content going on, and you should have a little green microphone button, and if that's green, you should be able to listen to us. However, the audio content is one way today, so we'll be talking to you, but you won't actually be able to talk to us. However, we'll have the chat, which I'll explain in the next slide. And just another point, obviously we're going to be showing an Excel calculator, and there's some quite detailed information there. So if you see on the top right-hand corner of your Adobe Connect application, you'll see there's a kind of little box with 4 arrows, and if you use that, that will enable you to zoom in and out. So if you can't see something very well, zoom in, and then if you want to zoom out to see better the full layout. Okay, so we will have a question and answer session. In fact, we will have 2 question and answer sessions. One after we've had a brief introduction to the calculator tool, and then a more detailed Q&A at the end. And you can use the chat option, which you should be able to see on your screen, and you just type in your question, and then we will try to respond to that. We're going to try and address as many questions as possible during the webinar, but if we have a lot of questions, we might not be able to tackle them all in the assigned time. And so if you still have something that you feel wasn't answered fully, or you want a more detailed explanation, if you submit them through the web form to EFSA App Desk, we'll be able to come back to you on that. Okay, so the objective of the webinar today is really to talk a bit about the calculation tool, which is in the annex of the EFSA guidance. And we're going to actually try and show you a few scenarios so you can see practically how the calculator tool works. And then obviously you can ask questions about it. And so this is the overall outline. My colleague Manuela would give you an overview of the guidance document, and then we start to have a look at the calculator tool, try some scenarios, and you have hopefully plenty of opportunity to post your questions, and we'll try and respond as best as we can. So I'm now going to hand you over to Manuela.
Yeah, just to add on what Jane said just a few minutes ago, the idea of having some case studies will help you to have practical examples. We try to pick up some of the most significant ones, and you will have time for question and answer. And at the end, we will try to summarize all the aspects that we have touched during the exercise. So I will bother you a bit now with a bit of background of the guidance for those of you that are not maybe familiar yet, or haven't followed very much the preparation of the guidance and the calculator annexed to the guidance. I remind you that, as Jane said, the calculator is the main subject of the webinar today. Here is the guidance. You have seen it probably in our website where it's published. It was published 1 year ago. And Today, we will main focus on the operator and worker exposure assessment. Why? The decision was discussed, and we thought that we would like to follow the endorsement at the EU level of the use of the calculator for operator and worker exposure assessment. So far, by the way, the endorsement means that as of January 2016, the calculator will be practically used and accepted for authorization of plant protection products. For us in the bystanders, though we fully understand that this could be definitely an issue at member state level, we decided for today not to touch it in depth, because of course there are some lacking aspects that we will see later on. For instance, the setting of an acute reference values for non-dietary exposure. The guidance started, let's say, its way to the final publication some years ago. And 8 years ago, EFSA outsourced a project for the listing and evaluation of all approaches and knowledge at that time with regard to the non-dietary exposure to pesticides. This resulted in a document which is published in our website, which led to the preparation of a scientific opinion in the pesticide, in the PPR panel with regard to the non-dietary exposure to pesticides, and also in the opinion the panel prepared a draft guidance in view of an activity to be done in this field. Shortly after that, the Commission asked EFSA officially to prepare a guidance document. We had the first draft of the guidance document in 2013. And it was subject also to a consultation in member states for commenting. In the meantime, the colleagues from BFR in Germany finalized a new model for agricultural operator exposure, the AOEM model. Therefore, it was decided in conjunction with Commission to check whether the AOEM model could have been included in the draft guidance we had, and this was the case, in fact. And we revised the document, which was presented for public consultation last year for 6 weeks. And finally, last year in October, we published it together with the calculator. The guidance main principles are related to the to a tier approach. So the guidance and the calculator annexed to it represent a standardized first-year exposure assessment for most scenarios present in Europe. Of course, not omnicomprehensive, but many scenarios, the most frequent, are represented. Anytime that a scenario is not covered by standardized methods reported in the guidance and in the calculator, of course, any appropriate ad hoc approach can be followed. In case, of course, there's a sort of, let's say, deviation from the standardized first-year approach, it's recommended to give an appropriate justification, and that should be clearly documented. The guidance is still based on the deterministic approach, even though EFSA is working in general on the probabilistic approach for many aspects of our activities. Unfortunately, for this specific topic, the database is limited, and it's not possible for the time being to proceed with a probabilistic approach. Also, the guidance indicated the need of considering and refining the risk assessment for pesticides that are acutely toxic, also for the non-dietary exposure, as it is done for the dietary exposure. The guidance defines the exposed groups, exposed not via food, but via dermal or inhalation routes, and lists also and evaluates all the existing standard models at the time it was prepared. The focus of the guidance and the results you will find in the calculator are only related to systemic toxicity, so local effects are not covered. Please keep in mind that the guidance and the calculator do not contain anything related to the dermal absorption, but the value itself. So the guidance on dermal absorption values derivation is another piece of work we are doing in EFSA currently. There's a revision ongoing of the dermal absorption guidance. This calculator and the guidance also do not apply to biocides and biological plant protection products, because the database on which the entire work is based is for chemicals mainly, and for pesticides chemicals. You might see that the guidance, might have seen that the guidance includes a number of recommendations and for future work, but also a huge number of default assumptions, values, parameters that have been included in the calculator. With regard to the data considered for the preparation of the guidance and the calculator, you can see them in the screen now. And when we prepared the guidance and the calculator, we went through as many data as possible, the data we had access to, and to the data that we could check what the information behind was. Out of this, of course, we made an assessment of the appropriateness and the suitability and availability of the data in order to prepare the final version of the guidance and of the calculator. Another important aspect that I would like to highlight to you is the analysis and the harmonization of default values that was done during the preparation of the guidance to be used in the calculator. I think this discussion, for those of you that have attended, for instance, some expert meetings for certain pesticides, one of the points of, let's say, a bit of debate is normally related to the use of specific default values and whether these default values are really representative or not of real situations. So the working group that prepared the guidance document and the calculator focused in particular on the following default values: body weight, breathing rate, average air concentrations, hectares treated per day, exposure durations, absorption values, and default surface area of body parts. This is what the calculator is looks like. We will see later on with Jane how it works. And I would like also to remind you the need of checking the calculator, using the calculator together with the guidance, but also you might find very useful information in the technical report following the public consultation on the draft guidance that was published together with the guidance and the calculator, because in there many of the questions that were raised at the time of the draft circulation could have been answered, and you could find them helpful. The guidance and the calculator mainly discriminate between acute and chronic assessments. And as I mentioned before, the concept of an acute reference values for non-dietary exposure is introduced. For the acute assessment, the use of the 95th percentile is suggested, whereas for the chronic assessment, the 75th percentile is suggested. And also, this is quite a new aspect compared to what we had so far. The resident and bystander exposure, the resident particular exposure assessment is introduced, but as I mentioned before, is not really the focus of the today webinar. A couple of words on the operator exposure. So the effort that was done by the working group preparing the guidance was to trying to find a harmonization where possible over the use of different models in Europe in the last 20 years. The excellent experience of the UK POEM and of the German model, though extremely, as I said, helpful, at a certain point identified some inconsistencies or the need of understanding where the gaps were. Great help was given by the colleagues in BFR that together with other institutions and companies in Europe prepare the AOEM model. And the added value was that it's a new exposure database which reflects the current agricultural operator exposure and risk assessment exposure in EU. Therefore, the risk assessment should reflect a more realistic scenario. With regard to some of the default values that I mentioned before, here there's an extract of the guidance where you can see how the working group decided to define the number of hectares treated per day. And you can see that depending on the handheld equipment or the vehicle-mounted equipment, they change. The same work, I have to say, quite difficult and relevant, was to establish the protection factor offered by the use of personal protective equipment. The result is this presented in the table now. And of course, we were aware that some refinement might be possible, but definitely further data would be necessary. With regard to the working exposure, for those of you that are not familiar, workers can be exposed to pesticides when re-enter treated areas after the application of plant protection products. In the database we have, as well as in the calculator, we have a certain level of uncertainty in terms of quality and reliability of data. And in particular, for the calculator, only the longer term exposure was considered because of the lack of data for shorter term data. In terms of exposure route, during the re-entry activities, the main exposure routes are dermal and inhalations, and that are due to contact with foliage, soil, and also dust. Oral exposure could be a source of exposure, of course, normally through to hand-to-mouth transfer, but the working group decided that this could be, let's say, negligible in comparison to the other major route of exposure. So in the guidance, you will see, and in the calculator as well, you will see the values used for assessing the exposure. And in particular, I would like to mention that the default value for exposure should be 8 hours for harvesting activities and maintenance type activities, whereas for crop inspection activities and irrigation type activities, only 2 hours should be considered. In particular, also, the dislodgeable foliar residues, so the amount of substances that is present in on a crop, as a first-year assessment should be assumed as being 3 microgram, whereas in the past we have always more or less used 1 microgram, but the data seems to indicate that this is a more appropriate value. Also, another point where refinement might be done is is related to the dissipation of chemical on a crop. And the working group went for a sort of conservative approach, considering many data of half-life for pesticides, indicating that it might be up to 30 days, and that therefore this is the value used for the first-year approach and assessment. The transfer of residues from the plant to the clothes or to the skin of the worker is represented by the transfer coefficient. You see them here now. We decided to start from the Europoem values, but also considering some US EPA values. These are the values that, after a discussion in the working group and a public consultation, were agreed as being the most representative so far, considering what we have. For the resident bystanders, a couple of words just saying that the database is limited, and also that we have some limitation in terms of the possibility of performing risk assessment because of the lack of an acute reference value for those classes. I want to highlight that the guidance and the calculator has some weaknesses in terms of scenario represented, because of course scenarios like seed treatment, greenhouse, home metal allotment, garden exposure scenarios, and other minor scenarios are not covered. Also, for the use of PPE, as I said before, a lot has to be done to try to refine the values, and also to consider what the situation at member state level could be, will be, so based on national measures that can be taken. For the workers, I want to remind you, also for the national perspective, but also for the EU perspective, that we need to further work on the TC and the DFR values. So, as I said, these are the main data gaps for the resident bystanders. We expect to have work done and developing in the near future. Browse project, for instance. EFSA is in this day assessing a procurement for an activity on resident bystanders. We know that also at member state level and companies are taking initiatives to fill some of the data gap. And also we intend to integrate field studies from published studies in the activity. And also BFR is working practically with greenhouse exposure. So, having said this, I think I can go over to Jane now for the
overview of the Excel calculator.
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully we're going to get the Excel sheet up on screen now for you to have a look at. And obviously, if anyone is, we're just going to show you the Excel calculator, and then we'll be able to give you a tour. Obviously, the calculator was primarily developed to illustrate how to practically perform the exposure assessment described in the guidance document. So this is the key purpose of the calculator, and it's developed in Excel. This is a tool that most people have access to on their office PCs, and therefore we felt this would be an appropriate tool, as it's something everyone's familiar with and has access to the software. So there are quite a few sheets in the Excel calculator. So first of all, we're going to give you a tour of the different worksheets just so you have an idea where to go in the calculator. And we're going to highlight some of the features. We've really tried very hard to make sure that when you've read the guidance document and you move to the calculator, that it's quite transparent how the information from the guidance document is then being applied in the calculator. And we do strongly recommend that you read the guidance document before you start with the calculator.
And also, if I may add on this, I mentioned already before, but I think we can try to be as interactive as possible. Also, the answers given during the public consultation are extremely helpful because they contain some answers that I'm pretty sure to some questions that I'm pretty sure some of you might have. We try to reflect them in the guidance, but maybe you could find further details and more details also in the technical report. So altogether, this can to have a very good picture, I suppose.
Exactly. Don't forget to check our website because there's a lot of supporting information there in relation to this. Okay, so the first sheet that you should come to is the instructions worksheet, and this just gives you some very brief instructions on which sheets to use. But the most important thing to check is the version number. So whenever we have to make a change to the calculator, we put a new dated version in, and we also provide instructions on what has been changed in the calculator. So you can see here in a previous version there was a small error in the 95th percentile for head exposure, and that's been corrected, and you can see that here. So that's the instructions. The first main sheet that you need to come to obviously is the data entry sheet. And the idea is that you should just be able to fill the values on one sheet, and then the calculations will subsequently be performed automatically through the rest of the sheets. There is a few refinements that you can do using drop-down values, but the key idea is to enter all the information in one sheet and the calculations are then automatically performed.
I don't know, Jane, if it's the moment now to mention this.
Yep, I think this is a good point.
Acronyms, because normally we are not familiar with this RVNAS. Indeed, this was something that we discussed in the working group, and at a certain point we decided to avoid confusion also with the users, to replace the usual name currently still in place, I have to say, of AOEL, acceptable operator exposure level, because in the guidance, in the opinion of the PPR panel, the mention of an acute AOEL was done. And so the idea of having the same assessment as it is done for the consumer with an acute reference dose was brought also to the non-dietary exposure context. However, as we don't have currently any methodology on deriving an acute AOEL, let's say so, at a certain point we decide let's leave the doors open to the future development. So we included both cells, one for the pesticides that are not acutely toxic, let's say the usual AOEL, which is normally based on a 90-day basis, but also we left the door open for, let's say, an acute AOEL that we called RVAAS, so reference values acutely toxic active substance. So when it will be, the methodology will be finalized, we will have anyhow the chance to include this in the guidance, in the calculator, without having the necessity to change too much.
Yeah, right? Perfect. Thanks for clarifying this, because this is most probably a little bit confusing when people first come in. So this is the sheet where you enter the data, and then technically you should just be able to click straight away to the summary sheet here, and all the results will be displayed here. And this is designed so that you can, for example, easily print it out on a printer if you need a summary of the information, or, for example, you can copy and paste into a Word document, and it provides all the input parameters and the results. We'll take another look at this when we come to the scenarios, and you'll perhaps see how it's filled in. Then we have the actual sheets where we have the details on the calculation. And it's here where we've really tried to be transparent about how you apply the guidance document. So at the top of the sheet, you will always see the input variables that are used for the calculations. Also, obviously, the units are specified here, and it's very important to check when you're entering data you have the right values. And then we use these variable names. So, for example, here we have the absorption of the product. This is a value that would have been entered in the data entry screen. And then when you go down further into the sheet, we actually try and provide the formulas that have been used to calculate the values that you can see in the Excel sheet. So here again, we see our I absorb product. And this means that the value at the top that you saw has been used to estimate the systemic exposure of hands. So that's a simple way to understand which variables are being combined to perform the exposure assessment. And then you will also find a summary of the exposure assessment here, considering the percentage of the AOEL that has been, whether we have an exceedance or not. The worker...
maybe.
Yeah, please go ahead.
If I say on the screen, close to operator of dose spray AOEM, there's an operator granules. Just to say to the audience, in case you haven't read yet the guidance, but so the main part of the operator exposure assessment for outdoor spraying, downwards and upwards, vehicle mounted and also handheld, is calculated through the new AOEM model.
That's the agricultural operator exposure model, yeah, developed by BFR.
Exactly. But we also have in the calculator and in the guidance this is mentioned, we have some data from rather, let's say, old model, the PHED, which covers something on granules. So we have some data, though, let's say, of a bit more limited value in terms of solidity of the approach and the methodology derived, but still we wanted to include because it's a help for the user.
Then we have the worker sheet, which we will also be looking at today. And again, you can see that we use the same approach of listing all the variables that are used in the calculation in this sheet with the units and also with the variable names, so that you can see where a different value is used in the calculation. So again, we see our absorption of the product, and we'll see later on, in this case, we're using the in-use dilution, the absorption of the in-use dilution. But again, you can see for full transparency, you can see which variables have been used, in this case, for example, to estimate the potential dermal exposure.
And maybe, Jane, there are also a sheet where we can see the default values.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's very helpful for me.
Let's have a look at the default values. So in the guidance document, there are actually quite a lot of default values that we use, and these are all listed here. So you can see the name of the default value as it's used in the calculator. So if this default value has been used, you will see this name in the other Excel worksheets. Then obviously we know what this default value is, the value that was specified in the calculator, and the units for that. So for example, we have here the treated area. So this would be for the operator exposure. and this would be the hectares that are used, and this is defined by crop type. And in fact, we can see a little bit more about that if we go to the small tables here. So in the small tables, there are, when you select certain values in the input screen, then certain values will be used for the calculator. So for example, if we're looking here, we can see when you select the crop, this will control, for example, the transfer coefficients, the activities, the hours per day, and also the area treated.
Yeah, and I think so. The approaches could be two. I mean, when you start playing with the calculator, if you want to become familiar, you can. We will see later with Jane. She'll guide us through. But we can go in the first page and insert in the parameter we have in the gap table. But on the other hand, I strongly suggest when you have done the exercise to go and see these pages, because there you see you can become more familiar with the automatic parameters that the calculator included after your selection, after your inputs included.
Exactly, but obviously these tables are also in the guidance document. So if you're entering the data into the input screen, maybe if you have the guidance document next to you, then you can also refer to the tables, and it will be then hopefully very clear for you how the different values are being combined to do the exposure assessment.
Yeah, and also this check of the values in the guidance and in this table is helpful in case of need of refinement, calculations, and so on, because there you can see where the most critical aspects are in terms of quantity, quality, and so on. So I think you can check from both sides what the outcome is and why you have such an outcome or a certain outcome.
And then the final sheet that we're going to look at today is the actual values that are derived from the model for the AOEM. So we can see the model allows a range of scenarios, and if you're using this sheet, you can filter to select the scenario that you're applying. So we're just looking simply here at downward spraying vehicle mounted, and you can see that the model allows you to predict the exposure for both the body, the hands, the head, inhalation, and also for protected body and protected hands. So for each of these body parts, we use the AOEM model to predict the exposure, and then we include the various coefficients that came from the model. And we can also see, for example, here where we're looking at the mixing and loading scenario, in fact, the model allows us to consider exposure for different formulations as well. And again, as well as reading the guidance document, I think we strongly recommend that you look at the AOEM report, and this will clearly explain how these values were obtained. So I think we are pretty much finished with the initial tour of the Excel sheet, and this gives you now an opportunity to ask a few questions if there's something that's not clear. We will show you some scenarios in a minute so you can actually see the calculator in action, and obviously maybe you will have additional questions here, but I think Manuela is going to start with a couple of questions.
Yeah, I think maybe just to before replying to a couple of questions we received, I just wanted to mention, as you talked about the protected operator and so on, I just wanted to tell you that the guidance considered that a normal workwear would include coveralls or long sleeve jacket plus trousers, both in cotton. So this is normal part of normal good working hygiene measures. So
yep, we'll definitely take a look at that in the scenario.
Yeah, later on. And then I've seen that Christian asked, why the resident is not discussed and whether the scenario should not be considered from 2016 onwards. No, I haven't been clear enough, obviously, so I will try to explain, but I think that the calculator that we are presenting today and the webinar today is for the use of guidance and calculator for worker exposure, because this specific use has been endorsed by Commission. So the Commission will accept and will, let's say, ask for the calculations for operator and worker exposure to plant protection products done with this calculator. For the resident bystanders, by law, it's a requirement, definitely. We have a tool here, so if you look at what we will be doing later on with the exercise, it's clear that you can also check the page on resident bystander, that's clear. But we don't want to emphasize this because, of course, we are aware that we are missing some values, AOEL and acute AOEL, and also some data to have an acceptable assessment of resident bystanders. Having said this, the Commission, I'm pretty sure, will consider this, and also you at the national level might have an issue on this. But today we decide to focus only on the calculator for these specific aspects, because this is the aspect that we need to check.
We have a question here, Manuela, about non-agricultural use. So I guess people are referring here to gardeners and people who are using pesticides maybe in their back garden. I think we can say generally here that the primary focus here is on agricultural application. And that's really because we have quite limited data from non-professional use, but it is an area that has to be considered. Would you like to say any more on that, Manuela?
No, I agree. I think it's very clear that the calculator does not apply to non-agricultural uses. And so no, let's say, extrapolations can be done to the quantities so-called small by the person who requested, to small quantity of pesticides, because the database is clearly based on data derived from field studies for agricultural purposes. So far, this is a gap, something that we don't have.
We do have a little bit of help here in that we do have a worksheet that allows to do recreational exposure. Yeah. So, for example, treatment of sports lawn or golf courses. There is an option to perform an exposure assessment there, but for really back garden application, we don't have.
Yeah. Okay, so let me go through.
I guess there's a question here about use of gloves, which is a good question, and I think we'll come to that in the next scenario. So if you can just hold and think about your use of gloves as PPE, and we'll explain that when we go through the scenarios.
Okay, maybe there are another couple of questions. There's another question related to...
Okay, this is a frequently asked question, shall we say, which is about the password protection on the Excel file. We have applied password protection because, as you can see, you can create this automatic summary sheet, for example, which you might want to copy into a document. And when people see that summary sheet, they would assume that the values as you specified in the guidance have been used to calculate the values shown in the summary sheet. And for this reason, we put a password protection on it, so that if you use that summary sheet, we'll know which values have been used to make those predictions for exposure. But also, I mean, we have the guidance document and we have the calculator, which is primarily to support the use of the guidance document. But I mean, when you're familiar with the calculations, other tools could be developed.
Yeah, indeed. And with regard to changing the default values if member states would require to do something. Well, for instance, I see that the colleagues in Denmark mentioned that the penetration factors of PPE are larger than the default values in other countries, for instance. Well, this is a point that I thank you for the question. Indeed, we reiterated in many cases that we need to have the possibility to refine if good and well done data are available. However, I would ask for a certain care in doing this, because I would, for instance, advise for the member states that are part of the same zone to try to build on this. I see the differences. I see that there might be differences. The values could be changed, definitely. My personal suggestion, I think, is to do it carefully and trying to check also with other member states in the zone in case there are similar experiences in terms of availability of PPE and so on.
But also, I guess to explain that in terms of the AOEM model, there were sufficient studies where PPE was used, and therefore actually what we use are the exposure is derived from the model and considers, for example, with and without gloves. And I think we'll see that in the scenarios when we move to those.
Yeah, that's very important, because people so far are used to apply protection factors, whereas for the OEM it's already included. Yeah. So we will see later in the clear example. And also, I think that there's another question with regard to the default values. Jane, the default treated areas can be modified only manually, right?
No, I mean, currently the default treated, obviously, again, you have to remember that, for example, some of the treated areas that we have were also came from the studies that we used, for example, for the model for the AOEM. So the data indicated that these were reasonable scenarios. So changing the area treated is really a refinement. But I mean, I think this is the important point to understand, that the guidance and the calculator are designed as an initial screening tool to see what kind of predicted exposures can be seen for the different groups, in particular operator and worker. But other values can be used, but they also need to be justified with evidence.
Yeah, in fact, for the values proposed for operators consider modern equipment used. And they are also considered to cover less modern equipment in correlation to smaller areas treated per day and using smaller amount of PPPs, always for agricultural uses. Therefore, the values that are proposed for the OEM shouldn't be adjusted for smaller area treated with less modern equipment. So, because the basis of the data is considering that it takes into account also less modern equipment, which would lead to normally to application in smaller areas. So this is something that shouldn't be done. But again, open attitude, trying to find the best solution. And okay. There's another question on drip irrigation and greenhouse. A good point. I think, well, for greenhouses, currently, we don't have any scenario in the guidance.
Except for, there is a brief scenario for the workers. If we look here, we do consider a very limited set of activities in relation to ornamentals in greenhouses. But one of the developments ongoing for the AOEM model is to look at the studies for greenhouse exposure and to do the same approach as they did for the outdoor exposures. And I think this will be something, when the BFR has finished the development of this model, that this will be something that we would perhaps like to integrate within the calculator.
And yeah, for the drip irrigation instead, I think we don't have anything. It's
No.
very specific. But in my experience, I had the chance to go through some field studies and real case studies. So I think for the time being, we don't have a scenario. So in this case, I would ask you to have real data and specific data on this.
Yeah, I guess this highlights the key thing really, that if people are doing studies to estimate that will be suitable to estimate exposure, it would be really important that these are made publicly available, and then people can start work on performing the sort of modelling that would allow us to use that data to support predictions in some of the scenarios that are currently missing.
And we have also another couple of questions related to the worker exposure and the post-harvesting interval on the PHI, sorry, so in relation to worker exposure. Okay, what to do if the estimated exposure exceeds the OEL? Just a couple of words on the fact that the way the re-entry exposure is calculated so far is the one immediately after treatment, as soon as the residue is dried. So we, at the moment, don't have other ways to calculate this. And we can only consider the number of applications that can be done and the interval between application. So what we have with the worker and with the gloves or without gloves is the let's say, worst case scenario. So re-entry immediately after treatment as soon as the spray is dried. So that's why we cannot cover the refinement in terms of waiting for re-entering and so on, unless we have data on dissipation and on the decay of the substance. No, Jane?
Yeah, exactly. So I think if we're going to try and move to the scenarios now, so we can show you a little bit how the calculator really works when we put some data in there. But keep sending your questions, because we have a second question and answer session once we finish the scenarios. And if there's something that you feel that we haven't dealt with so far, we'll try and answer your question then. So if we're going to use the calculator, we now need to do the data entry. So we're going to look at a reasonably simple scenario, a tractor-mounted scenario for nectarine. So I'll just... the first box allows you to enter the name of the substance that you're assessing, but here we're just going to type in the scenario type just so we know what we're looking at. Okay, so obviously the first thing you need is your AOEL, your acceptable operator exposure level. And in this case, we have, in our example, we're using 0.07. Then we need to select the crop type. Now, we offer drop downs to help people make the correct selections, and obviously these drop downs derive a number of the values that you will see in the subsequent calculations. And also, obviously, the crop type is not comprehensive, but we think that we cover the most common scenarios. So in this case, we're looking at nectarine, so we want to find the stone fruit, sorry.
Yeah.
We would need to look at the stone fruit option. It's always a good idea to fill the input screen from top to bottom, because when you make a selection on one drop down, this can affect the drop downs later in the form. And always keep an eye on the unit. So in this case, we're going to look at wettable granules. And then we need to enter the minimum volume of water. So when you look at your gap table, you maybe see there's a range. In this case, we need to put the minimum volume, and we're going to use 200 litres per hectare, and that's important.
Yeah, the minimum, just to have the highest concentration later on, leading to the possible worst case.
And then we're going to have to enter the application rate. And obviously this is really quite a critical value for the whole calculation. So please make sure that you put your value in kilograms per active substance per hectare, because often, in some cases, this is expressed in grams, so you need to convert to kilograms. Then these are default values. This is the DT50 and the initial dislodgeable foliar residue. However, if you do have experimental data, then you can change those values.
And if I may add on this, Jane, with regard to the 30 days, I think some people might say, look, it's very, very high, where indeed also this value is the default in case of no experimental data is available. And it was decided to follow this approach considering a number of dissipation values for pesticides reported in appendixes C and D of the guidance, where it was indicated that the DT50 values could have reached and exceeded also the 30 days for some active substance. Therefore, it was decided to take this approach. But again, if data are different from this, showing different dissipation time, would be available, that they of course can be used.
Okay, then we need to put in the dermal absorption, which hopefully this information should be provided, for example, in the dossier. So we're going to use 0.02
in the dossier, or
for the actual the concentrated product, and then we can provide a different value for the in-use dilution. Sorry, go ahead.
No, just wanted to say that depending on the phase of the activity, you could find it in the dossier or in the RAR, or in the list of endpoints of the EFSA conclusion. So depending where you are in the phase, you can see it in different parts. Maybe one word, Jane, for the oral absorption. We said more or less that the oral absorption is not, for what we are considering today, that relevant, or at least the data we have available do not show for the time being such a relevant, or cannot show such a relevance. However, if the oral absorption of the active substance, which will be used for hand-to-mouth and other aspects of the calculation, so not directly relevant today, but if it's less than 80% as it could be shown in the list of endpoints in the final assessment of the substance, if it's lower than 80%, the value will be kept. If it's higher than 80%, the calculator will automatically go to 100%, because this is a sort of default and agreement down that the absorption is almost complete.
Okay, and then we'll finish the scenario. So we're doing an outdoor scenario in this case. We're looking at upward spraying as we're looking at a tree, and we are going to use a simple vehicle mounted scenario. And in this case, we're going to imagine that we have 2 applications, and these are 7 days apart. So now we should have completed all the necessary information that we need to do pretty much all the calculations in the calculator. And so if we take a look at the summary sheet, we can see here, now this is summarized. So at the top, we're focusing on the input parameters. So we can see that the scenario is stone fruit outdoor upward spraying vehicle mounted. Here are the absorption values used. This is the AOEL that we supplied and some of the other default values. And then we can look down, and here we have the operator exposure shown here and the worker exposure shown here. And just taking a quick look, we can see that in fact in both cases the predicted exposure is below the AOER. So we can see here, there's here for the operator and also for the worker. But I think it's more useful. Obviously, this gives you a summary and it's very useful. But I think it's important to always go in and actually take a look at each of the values that have been predicted so you can be sure what you're looking at. So here we go and have a look at the outdoor exposure. And here we can see some of the defaults coming in. So because we're using upward spraying for tree crops, here it's 10 hectares per day is the area treated that we use. Here we can see some of the input values that we've put in. And then here we can see the predicted exposure from the AOEM model. You can see here that it's the AOEM model. And again, as I explained, you can see that we get different values. So here we have hands, body, and head. And this is assuming no protection. And then we can also see what the values would be if we have protection. So this is gloves, and we had a question about that earlier. So you can see that this actually comes from the data sets. They were able to allow us to estimate the exposure when gloves are worn, when workwear are worn, and this is really just assuming that the body, arms and legs are covered, and if head protection is worn, and also we have inhalation there. So that's for the mixing and loading, and then also we can see further down here, this is for the application, and again we have the same information. We have the head, hands, body and head without any protection, and then with protection considering gloves and workwear. So here, certainly for the hand and body exposure, we don't use penetration factors. We actually use the values that they were able to estimate from the model. And then if we scroll down a little bit further, we can see here we have the exposure without PPE and the exposure with PPE. And we haven't actually made any changes here, but the difference is that here this is assuming that the body is really not having any protection from clothing, and in the second one we're assuming that long trousers and a shirt, for example, are worn. And we can see here that actually, in fact, in both cases we didn't exceed the AOER. So that's the operators. Do you want to add anything here, Manuela, or shall we take a look at the work?
Yeah, because we have a question related to this, so it's nice to see.
Okay, so here we have the worker, and again we can see at the top these are the input parameters, and then here we start to see the scenarios that we're using. So being as this is stone fruit, here we're using a searching, we're imagining that the exposure is through searching, reaching and picking of our nectarines, and the main body parts in contact are the hand and the body. In this case, we're assuming that the activity is performed for 8 hours, and then we have the different transfer coefficients, and these came from the Europoem project, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and maybe as we are here in the work, maybe we can take the chance to go through a couple of questions on this, because I think it's appropriate to see them here now. So one, for instance, you see here that the working hours spent for the searching, reaching, picking in stone fruit is 8 hours. So a question we received is related to what is an appropriate duration. In this case, we have a question on herbicides in grapes or orchard, and whether 2 or 8 hours, assuming that re-entry activities is in grapes are not necessary crop inspection but longer activity. Well, I think this is the answer. As soon as the activity is related to activities other than inspection or irrigation, the 8 hours is definitely the value.
We're really looking predominantly at, for example, harvesting scenarios, and we imagine that the worker would be doing the standard European directive working time of 8 hours.
Yeah, exactly. And another question, maybe something less related to this specific case, but someone is asking, what is the extra position about using gloves as refinement in the work exposure assessment? Well, I think this is also reflected in guidance. We had a discussion indeed, because we are aware that at member state level there are different views with regard to this. I think that anytime you perform an assessment and you have a certain level of confidence that the worker has gloves available, and he or she is aware how this should be used, and is well trained, then the use of PPE is justified. Definitely. So it's a level of refinement on which we cannot really have control, but we think that as any other working activities, if we are confident that this would be used and should be used in case of any exposure exceeding the OEL, then it should be applied. I think I'm reflecting the view of the working group as well. It's reported in the guidance. But I know that at member state level there might be slightly different views.
So we can see here in our scenario that where the worker is only wearing standard workwear, so covered arms, body and legs, we're just slightly over the AOEL. However, with when gloves are being worn, this would give the workers protection. So I think we maybe move to the next scenario, because also this has a little bit of a theme about gloves as well.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to look at grapes as a scenario, which is also quite a common scenario, certainly here in Italy. We have quite some applications to grapes. So we just rename the scenario so we know what we're looking at, and we're just going to change the AOEL to 0.05. These are sort of examples taken on what we consider to be a reasonably realistic scenario from previous assessment. Excuse me. And we're going to switch to grapes now. So we select grapes from the drop-down list. And in this case, we're going to use a soluble concentrate formulation. And then we need to fill in, again, the minimum in litres per hectare of water used for application. And the critical value, of course, is the application rate of 0.025. We leave the defaults as is. And in this case, we're going to assume that we have no information on the dermal absorption of the product, and in this case 75 could be is considered to be an acceptable default value. Manuela, would you like to just explain a little bit more about that?
About the default?
Yeah, if you don't have data for dermal absorption.
Yeah. We have a guidance document in EFSA currently under revision, by the way, because of new data available. But the guidance is including the cases where there are no data on dermal absorption, experimental data. So the value of 25 for the concentrate and 75 for the dilution are reported, are indicated. So maybe for the product we could go for 25, and for the up one, yeah. But these data are based on the revision of a huge number of experimental data showing that these are the maximum value if you don't have anything. The approach, as I said, is under revision, so the values might change, but for the time being, these are the official one and agreed ones.
Okay, that's great. And then again, we're looking at an outdoor upward spraying vehicle mounted scenario, but in this case, we'll imagine that there are 3 applications with a 14-day interval. So let's take a look at our operator exposure. Oh, why does it do that? There.
We have a problem, but the colleagues are trying to fix it up.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks. Okay, so we're back in our scenario again. So if we just take a look at the top, we can see that we're still using 10 hectares per day. And again, we can see that we have the modelled value, the predictions from the AOAM model. And again, we're just using normal workwear is the only PPE applied. In this case, again, we find that we're below the AOEL. But if we take a look at the worker, we see that we have a potential problem here. And this is because we do still have some missing data.
Yeah.
So we have these values came from the EPA, I think, if I'm correct.
Yeah, you are.
They have values for potential exposure and with arms, legs, and body covered, but I don't think they had data to.
Yeah, I think for grapes, which is a relevant scenario in Europe and also in terms of the level of exposure, the working group we decided to take on board data on which we didn't really have a full control in terms of a knowledge of the raw data, because anyhow we decided that they were conservative, and this could have given us the opportunity to have a scenario covered, a relevant one. But of course, the indication is that we need further data. And in particular, you can also see that there's no transfer coefficient available for the highest level of protection for the re-entry workers.
So, and I guess this highlights a kind of research gap, and
indeed,
that a good, well-conducted study looking at worker exposure, again, particularly in terms of harvesting for grapes, would be extremely useful to try and estimate these transfer coefficients.
Indeed.
Okay, so now I think we will look at a slightly different scenario. So the last two scenarios we've been looking at are upward spraying. But now we're going to take a look at cereal application, if I can spell it correctly.
You can make it. Okay.
Yeah, well done. Okay. And for this scenario, we're going to use AOEL of 0.02. Again, these are all values that we've derived from previous assessments. Yeah. We're going to choose the cereals crop option, and in this case we're going to consider wettable powder. The minimum volume of water is 200, and we're going to use application of rate of 0.03. Again, we leave the defaults here. But in this case, we have dermal absorption of around 3% for the product and 18% for the in-use dilution. And here we need to switch a bit because we want to use downward spraying. Again, it is vehicle mounted, and we're just going to do one application. Okay. I've got a bit of an error there, Manuela.
Yeah.
So the error trapping isn't 100% in the application because it's a simple Excel application. And to do more advanced work, we would have to use macros. And some people's IT environment would not allow them to use macros. So we use just some simple messaging. So if you see some red text come up, it means that something you've entered is you need to check that value and see whether you've entered the correct value. And in this case, if it's one application, we need 365 days because we're assuming that's one application in a year.
And the message disappears.
And the message disappears, so you're okay. So when using the calculator, if you see some red text, stop, take a look. Make sure that you think you've entered the variable correctly. And if you're still not sure, obviously check the EFSA guidance document because it's most probably explained there. Now, if we go and take a look at our operator exposure here, here now, because we're moving to a downward spraying scenario, we have 50 hectares per day, so we're looking at a larger treated area.
And again, this goes back to the OEM data.
Exactly, yes. This is from the types of studies that they had available. And we can see that in this case, we are above the AOEL even with workwear being used. So just with the protection from trousers and shirt, for example. So if we want to understand this a little better, we can actually go further down the sheet. And here we can see the mixing and loading exposure. And further down, we can see the application. And in fact, we can see here that the systemic exposure for application is quite low. But when we move up, and if we look at the exposure for mixing and loading, we can see that we have some quite high exposure here, particularly for inhalation and the body and the hands.
Indeed. Doing this check is, maybe I'm saying something a bit obvious for most of you, but apologize for this, but this is also helpful to check what are the most exposed part of the body and where you could
exactly.
do something to
and
revive.
Here, because we know now that excuse me, the problem is with mixing and loading. If we move to the mixing and loading area here, we can see that we do actually have some options. So currently, we're not applying gloves. So if we select yes, then when we look at the values in the PPE area below, we can use this estimation of exposure considering protected hands. And we can see already here that from hands, the exposure in terms of micrograms per day, this is the exposure without gloves and this is the exposure with gloves. So we can see that if we apply gloves, we should be able to reduce the exposure. But we also see here for inhalation, this is also quite high. And in this case, we could additionally select to use, for example, some kind of respiratory equipment. Now, here is the one area where it differs, and here we are using penetration factors. If they use, for example, hood and visor, this comes from the AOE model, but if you select to use respiratory PPE, then we start to use the penetration factors to estimate the reduction in exposure. So now if we go down and have a look at our results here, we can see for the systemic exposure for both mixing and loading and application without any PPE at all, which also includes body exposure, we can see that we're above the AOEL. But here, by applying a face mask and gloves in the mixing scenario, we're now below the AOEL.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to add anything there, Manuela?
No. I was just thinking to something that maybe we can comment in the re-entry, so the work exposure. If you
yeah, let's have a look at the worker exposure.
Yeah, because before we mentioned, if you remember, the use of gloves and also the calculation of re-entry period. Something that I think someone asked here and there. So in principle, if we want to sort out, let's see what the outcome is.
In this case, I think we should just say that for cereals, we're looking at a slightly different exposure in terms of the workers' exposure, because generally harvesting is performed by machinery. So in this case, we're imagining that the worker maybe goes into the field to perform inspection or irrigation activities. And so for this case, we're looking at hand and body exposure, but also the working hours are shorter here. We imagine that you would only spend a short time, so 2 hours, doing this type of activity. And obviously, because of that, when we see here that the actual exposure for the worker is much lower because the scenario has considerably less contact with the crop, for example.
Yeah, exactly. As a general point, however, I think that in case the worker exposure is showing an exceedance of the reference values, of course, a re-entry period could calculate based on good available data in terms of decline or dislodgeable foliar residue study decline. That's yes, that's correct. And this is one of the level of refinement that we not only need but encourage, because this would feed further the calculator and the guidance.
So, exactly, because I mean, you can see here that obviously the exposure is pretty much dependent on the application rate and the DFR. So if you have experimental data for a DFR, you could apply that in the calculator.
Well, Jane, I think maybe we are running short of time. I think we have another 10 minutes for one.
Shall we do one more scenario?
Yeah, one more scenario, and then we have some time to answer the questions, because we have some pending. Yeah?
Oh, that's a good idea. So shall we just take one look at the handheld scenario then, do you think? Okay, cool. Let's have a look at that. So here we're going to look at an example, again in an orchard, but here we're not going to use vehicle-mounted equipment. So we're going to imagine that someone is using, for example, a knapsack in an orchard. So we change put the AOEL in this case we're going for 0.05, and we're going to use palm fruit, so we're imagining maybe we're looking at something like apple trees or something like that. We're going to use soluble concentrate, 200 we leave as is, and an application rate of 0.02. And we're going to have a dermal exposure of 0.04 for the product and 2% for the in-use dilution.
So in this case, we have a quite low absorption values. Let's see what happens, because we have also a low application rate. What comes?
But we'll consider that we're spraying upward, but with handheld equipment. Okay, and we'll have 2 applications 7 days apart. Okay, so shall we just take a look at the operator first?
Sorry, Jane, aren't we interested in the season?
Yes, we are.
Oh, no, we might not be, yeah?
We can indicate the season, so let's say that we're in a late dense foliage situation. This most probably won't be so important for the operator or the worker, but certainly if you were using resident bystander, this becomes a bit more critical.
So I think we have it in it, and it could also be for exposure touching something.
I think there is one case in terms of the operator exposure model where for a specific scenario they were able to model the effect of a dense foliage.
Yeah.
And in this case that would be applicable.
But I just wanted to show that it's there. We can go back to the normal, the no scenario like this.
We say not relevant
just
for now.
Be aware that it's in there for specific cases.
Okay, so for worker, here we can say in fact the area treated has changed again, and in this case we're imagining 4 hectares, because this is a person who has to walk around, and obviously he's not going to manage the full 50 hectares we use for the downward. Yeah,
but indeed, Jane, for handheld, you remember before probably the table where I show the 4 and the 1. You have maybe
we have that here. Yeah, if we look in the small tables.
Yeah, we have both 4 and 1 for some of the scenario. Probably not appearing here.
No.
Yeah, but I presented it in my presentation. And the first value, so the 4, should be used for handheld application using tank sprayers with lenses, whereas the 1 value should be used for other
for the knapsack
equipment, the
particularly.
knapsack.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the difference. So you can, based on what you need, have different values. And for upward spraying with handheld equipment of dense foliage, the treated area is 1 hectare.
It is, yeah.
These are the cases, and this again is reported in the guidance. For instance, the specific case, the table, and this data on why we have 4 or 1 are reported on page 13. So going back to what Jane said, let's use it always in conjunction.
Exactly. I think it really highlights that it's really handy to have the guidance open while you're using the calculator. Indeed. And then it's really clear. So here we can see again our exposure values, and we'll see actually for mixing and loading the exposure values are lower than we've seen in the previous scenarios, but we're obviously dealing with a smaller quantity of active substance compared with doing a large tank mix. And then also we can see here, but here we see, for example, the body exposure is quite high in the application scenario. So if we go to our results, we still see that actually if the operator is wearing full workwear with the values that we've put into the data entry sheet, they would be below the AOEL. And we can also take a look at our worker, and in this case we have transfer coefficients also for wearing gloves, but we can also see here that the worker would also be is estimated to be below the AOEL, even in just workwear. So I think we maybe should give a chance for people to ask a few questions.
I think so. I think we have some, and maybe I would keep the calculator open because we might go back to some parts because for sure. I've seen already something on cabin, and you might be ready to.
Okay.
So I think
we'll try our best to try and illustrate the questions using the calculator.
Exactly. So I think. We can start. So now to the others, just we start for about 20 minutes of a question and answer, right? And then we will try to sum up what we've got from this morning session and the online discussion we got. I would start with a question that was referring to our position towards a puffer pack model for amateur granular application, if it will be included in the harmonized model. Well, I think I can give a general answer to this. And this is really a principle for this activity, the whole activity we are running around the non-dietary exposure to pesticides. So I think anytime new and good quality data are made available, are prepared, any new studies that is published and so on. And if someone has the wish to propose these studies to be included in the guidance document, I think that the good channel would be contacting Commission, indicating that there are new data available that might be considered for inclusion.
I guess also making the data sets available to EFSA, etc., because the actual raw data most probably would be needed in order to, for example, use the approach that we have done with the operator, where we can try and model the percentiles and then therefore use that to estimate exposure.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the channels would be directed to come or through us also, but in a way we work together, and we will see whether Commission see the needs of including further new data. But in principle, as we did a lot of work in trying to recover data, finding data, and having the best calculator possible in terms of availability of data, we would really welcome having new data.
I think there's a question on default values. Shall I tackle that one?
I think so, you should do.
So if we go to the data, the default values you can change are pretty simple. They're the ones in the input screen. So for example, you can change the DFR, you can change the DT50, you can change the absorption. These can all be changed. Also, you can change these. I mean, obviously 1 and 365. This is already showing where you can change the values because the standard is 1 and 365, but you can change them back to 2 and 21, for example. So any of these default values can be changed. However, any of the default values that are in this sheet are fixed. So I think that hopefully is pretty clear for you. If it's in the input screen, you do have the chance to change it. However, if it's in the default values list, those ones are fixed within the application.
The reason behind this is that we wanted to guarantee, in terms with the purpose of harmonizing and also for the evaluator and the assessor, that we can start from fixed point, let's say from agreed points. Of course, you can find things manually. Mm-hmm. That's always there. But we wanted to avoid that we could receive results that for which you cannot really track back what the inputs were and if something has been changed. So we try to fix some of them so that if someone presenting a risk assessment decides to change, this should be documented clearly in a text and indicating the reasons why.
I guess also a goal of the guidance document was to achieve harmonization for non-dietary exposure in Europe. And therefore having, for example, default values for the adult and the child body weight and some of the other values that we collect. So, for example, for breathing rates, it was quite important really just to define default values so that everyone is at least performing the initial screening exposure in the same way. Obviously, for a particular substance, if you have experimental data or you know that those scenarios aren't entirely appropriate, that can then be done. But this is just to allow a harmonized screen, isn't it?
I want to spend another couple of words on this default because the work we did has been huge in terms of trying to find the best default for the most representative situation. It was not easy, I have to admit. We had a lot of discussion and considerations, and we think that currently this is the best approach, keeping in mind worst case and realistic scenario and so on. We are open to the fact that these values might change because normally many of these values have changed over the years because of new studies and so on. So for the time being, I think this is a sort of standard that we could try to adopt in terms of a first-year approach. This doesn't mean that, okay, anytime you want to change, then you overlook completely the rest and you change just because this in the end adjust the result. We would really be helped by the support of many of you listening today to have revised new data if there's good ground for having new data. So really, this is also a message of, look, these are the weaknesses or the limited data. Please provide data if you have the chance.
There's a nice question here, Manuela, on reuse of PPE. What's your opinion on that one?
Well, I think again in the good working practice hygiene measures, the reuse of PPE can be done, but of course this means that the PPE has to be duly maintained and cleaned and so on. So obviously, if the workers reuse, for instance, gloves that have been already used and likely, therefore, are likely to be dirty, let's say, obviously the gloves themselves become a sort of reservoir of the active, and they will lead to exposure in addition to the new exposure or the new use. This is the theory. Obviously, it could also be that the glove is saturated of pesticides, and so
I guess it kind of highlights also the importance of training, both for operators and workers, so people can understand a bit more about how to protect themselves and what's best practice.
Yeah, indeed, Jane. This is very important. This issue of working practices has crossed many times our activity in preparing the guidance, because indeed we are giving the theoretical scenario, but the other side of the story, big part, is the good training of worker and operator, without which we are probably not doing as much as we should or could. Because, of course, we need to start from the assumption that the work is performed correctly, and we cannot derogate on this.
I see there's a nice question about the closed cabin, and we did have a scenario that we could maybe show here. So we're pleased this question came in, because we prepared an additional scenario.
Yeah, I can tell you what the question was saying. The operation calculation for fish traps tractor mounted downward spraying, as far as I understand, closed cabin is a default. So all applications are calculated for closed cabin. Well, there's something here to say.
We'll show you a demonstration, and we'll also try and explain how it works a bit. So here we're going to do AOEL of 0.1, and we're going to look at, say, for example, citrus fruit, although in fact really for any of the trees it doesn't really matter so much, they're quite similar. We stay with the soluble concentrates, 200, and we change the application rate to 0.1. So we're using a reasonable concentration of, we're going to have quite a high amount of active substance. I put the defaults back to their original values and put 10 and 20 for the dermal exposure. Put that one back to the default. And here we're going to look at outdoor spraying, upward spraying, and we're going to look at vehicle mounted, because obviously the closed cab option is only applicable when we're looking at a vehicle mounted scenario, and we'll go back to just one application. Okay, so we're going to look again at the operator. So again, we have our 10, and we can see the different exposure values here. So this is for the mixing and loading, and this is for the application. And at the moment here, you can see closed cabin. Here at the moment, the default is that no closed cabin is selected. And I think that's an important thing to explain, that the closed cabin option is only appropriate for upward spraying. So the AOEM model, they had a number of studies of upward spraying where they were using cabins for the application, and therefore they're able to put create a model that allows us to estimate exposure when the operator is in a closed cabin. For downward spraying, the closed cabin isn't available because we didn't have, there wasn't data of cases where the application was done using a closed cabin.
Yeah, that's an important point, because so far we didn't have anything available for closed cabin. Yeah. Now we have something, so that's a very good example.
Shall we just have a look and see what happens if we do with and without? So here, for example, we can see without PPE, so this is the potential exposure, we're above the AOEL. And with PPE, and in this case so far, we're only considering the workwear. We're at 138. And if we have again, it's useful to look, we can see here that there's quite some exposure to the hands during the mixing and loading, and there is quite some exposure to the hands and body during the application. So here again, we can put some options. So if we apply gloves, for example, here for mixing and loading, let me just take the respiratory equipment off because that's going to give us, we just go back to non there. But we have the gloves on, and here, and we can still see that we're above the AOEL. But now if we apply the closed cab, we can see that reduces it. And I guess one thing to consider is obviously you also have the option to choose gloves instead, but perhaps a closed cab is maybe more realistic.
Yeah, or maybe more feasible. Can you scroll up a bit, Jane? So again, okay, reference. So add this value for the protected workwear. Okay, yes, I couldn't see that. Okay.
Yeah,
perfect.
So in the end here, we're assuming that workwear is worn both for mixing and loading and application.
Yeah.
That the operator wears gloves to perform the mixing and loading, but then for the application to reduce the exposure, a closed cabin is used. So hopefully that explains and clears up a few questions about the closed cabin option.
I think so. Well, I think also that we can, as we have still less than 10 minutes, maybe we could try to
do some last key questions.
And again, there's another question on what are the extra plans to include into the model and the calculator small-scale PPE used with different formulation and so on and so on. Also for the non-professional. Well, for the time being, the guidance is for professional. But as I said, in principle, as soon as new data become available, new and good quality data become available, and Commission and EFSA are asked about, we might find a way through Commission mandating us to revise the guidance to include them, provided that they are of quality.
But in terms of molluscicides and substances of that type, we do, as you already explained, have some. We do have a few scenarios from the PHED model to look at granular applications, but the data is quite limited here, I think. But you can at least look for some of the granular applications.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm checking just that the last one that we have.
This one might be a useful one about the workwear. Just to be clear, in the operator sheet, we don't actually, in the end, we took out an option to consider certified coveralls, and because the penetration factor really wasn't clear here. But from the AOEM model, you can consider either potential exposure, where you imagine that the operator isn't really wearing much at all in terms of covered clothes,
and then the naked.
Exactly, and then you can, but when the values assume as a default that the operator is at least wearing trousers and a shirt, which
should be made of cotton with some characteristic. You can see in the glossary, cotton or cotton polyester, some characteristics. Whether this applies to type 3, 4, 5, that's another issue. But we know that we could bring this in the guidance. And you see in the glossary, page 55, what a workwear is. Then I'm just checking the last question, if we still have a couple of minutes. Sorry, we are reading with you. We are really doing it live. Well, as I said, again, the issue of PP, certified coverall, is given in the guidance, but not included in the calculator. No, because we know that the characteristic of a normal workwear, as defined, as I mentioned before, obviously, the certified was meant to indicate as much as possible something for which you could characterize as much as possible the specific properties. That's the idea. So, as I said at the very beginning, there's still a lot to do with regard to this level of certification, and this is a part of the missing information we have. And someone is asking whether we are planning to issue a guidance document on dislodgeable foliar residues. Well, I wouldn't say so. You might be aware that recently a call for procurement was closed, including the collection of many data, including some DFR data. For the guidance, I'm not aware that there will be a guidance on DFR. Definitely, the more DFR data we have, the better, because these will support the refinement of the calculations we have. And a work that we are currently doing is also in this direction. Okay, anything else, Jane, that you see that?
I think many of the questions we've kind of touched on already. I guess there's an interesting question about obviously the minimum water volume. And the fact that obviously if the dermal in-use dilution, dermal absorption is lower than the product, for example, in that case.
Yeah, obviously, we agree that maybe might not be the worst case, but normally we consider it is because we want to have the person exposed to the highest concentration.
In fact, I think though the minimum water volume is actually not used in the operator or the worker exposure. That's actually when we come into the resident and bystander exposure, particularly when we're trying to look at concentrations in spray drift, etc. So in the two scenarios we've discussed today, in fact, that variable isn't quite so critical, but it's a good point.
It is indeed. Well, I think something that is really looking into the future perspective. Some colleagues from home are asking, does the model take into account if more than one active ingredient is used, and does it take into account products that do not need dilution, the mixed product, granules, and so on? Okay.
I think this is a nice question to finish on, in fact, because cumulative exposure is becoming more important. So,
and there's a lot of work ongoing, and in-house, for instance, but not only in EFSA. So in EFSA, the model does not take into account mixed products. To do this, of course, we need two aspects. We need the toxicological aspect of the story, and then, the exposure part. That might be, maybe not necessarily, refine accordingly. But definitely we need to understand how to define the contribution of the
I mean, there is some work now going on in terms of dietary exposure, looking at cumulative exposure. And I guess as that method develops, then hopefully this could then become integrated in non-dietary exposure. But it's certainly a key area for methodological development.
Yeah. And with regard to the question on whether the model takes into account products that do not need dilution.
There is the granule scenario, obviously, and there is an option. In fact, I think you can see it on the screen now. for the water-soluble bag. But again, we actually had limited data really on how this would affect.
And the value there is mainly based on expert judgment of the
Exactly,
working group. It's
yeah.
clearly mentioned. So there's still some to do,
Yeah.
I would say, on this. This is another...
I guess another more data needed, please.
More data needed, please. So I think, well, thank you very much for this question, Jane. I think...
perhaps we should sum up now,
yeah,
do you think?
Yeah, okay.
I think we've really enjoyed answering everyone's questions. So we definitely... I think you're going to see us on the webcam now as well. So
yes, we are back, and okay, let's see the conclusion. Well, waiting for having, we drafted some conclusion already before. So, but I think and during the webinar. Well, I think, Jane, I think that the calculator is really user-friendly. I think today we showed how we play. I mean, you were so fast and easy in
But I
playing
think
with
we're
this.
always open to feedback as well, aren't we? If anyone has suggestions, please share them with us.
So what we feel is that the calculator is a user-friendly tool, and to start with the first-year assessment. And so I think, well, it's nice to have your feedback if this is not the case, but I think we had some nice time here to play with it together almost with you. Many scenarios are covered, but as it came out in many cases, we know that the guidance as it is now is completely exhaustive. So we need new data in many parts, small bits and pieces here and there, but we need data. And also an important point we wanted to raise is the existing scenario that can be further refined if we have new data. Jane was very clear in clarifying whether which default values can be changed if needed. And as a general principle, we invite you to give us new data in case you have good reasons to change them. And so we could open up on new approaches. Needless to say that the database is more solid for operator and workers. And then to conclude, oops, sorry, okay. For any questions we haven't answered to you properly or for the lack of time, please don't hesitate to go back to the FSAP desk through the web form attached. And also you could easily check in the pesticides webpage for further information. If I'm not mistaken, there's a survey that you will receive.
Because this is our first webinar, so I think a bit of feedback from everyone will hopefully make the next webinars even better.
I think so. Keep this in mind when you will fill in your form. But no, it was very nice to start this exercise, and I think I enjoyed quite a lot today.
Yeah, I think thank you very much, everyone who logged in today. I hope that you haven't had any technical problems as this is our first go. The questions have been really good questions, and it's been good to go through them and understand a bit about issues.
No, they allowed us to touch many points that indeed are of interest. So we remain here at disposal for any issue related to this. And so thank you and enjoy your day then.